He thought he didn't have a child, until a little girl called and said, "Dad, Mom's in the ICU." Andrew Lawson didn't believe in mess. Not in life, not in business, and certainly not in relationships. He had structured his world to be clean, controlled, and self-contained. The office on the top floor of Lawson Global reflected that perfectly. Glass walls, concrete floors, monochrome art. His desk was spotless, his schedule tighter than a drum, and his heart, well, no one was allowed close enough to test if it even responded anymore. He had spent 2 decades building one of the most profitable biotech firms in the country, turning failures into acquisitions and risks into dividends. He was a man the world admired, envied, and quietly feared. But no one really knew him. That was exactly how he liked it. Years ago, in what now felt like another life entirely, there had been one exception. Her name was Hannah Mason. She wasn't part of his business world. She was warmth in a form he didn't understand at the time. She worked in interior design and loved details Andrew never noticed. She laughed easily, cried openly, and treated love like it was something sacred, not strategic. They had met by accident, quite literally. When she spilled her coffee on him in the lobby of his building, he had been furious, and she had laughed. He hadn't laughed back, but he'd called her later anyway. What followed wasn't a traditional relationship. Andrew wasn't wired for intimacy, and Hannah had sensed it. Still, she stayed. For a time. Their moments were small but unforgettable, long walks at night. Debates over wine about art versus science. Quiet mornings where she hummed while watering her plants. She never tried to fix him. She just offered space for him to be someone softer. And he did soften, briefly, until the moment she brought up something real, something permanent. She told him she was pregnant. He had stood there, frozen, staring at her across the kitchen counter like she had spoken in a language he couldn't translate. It was late. The city lights poured through the windows behind her. He remembered the way her hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed firm. She wasn't asking him for anything, just telling him the truth. And that, perhaps, was what scared him most. There had been no manipulation, no drama, just honesty. His response had been ice cold. He told her he wasn't ready, that it was irresponsible, that maybe it wasn't even his. The words came fast and sharp, thrown like knives before he even thought to hold them back. Hannah didn't cry. She just looked at him for a long time and said, "I hoped you'd be better than this." Then she packed her things and left. He didn't stop her. He told himself it was the right thing, that it was better for both of them. That he wasn't built for fatherhood, for family, for feeling anything that might compromise his focus. And then she was gone. He hadn't heard from her again. No calls, no messages, no updates. A small part of him, the part he kept locked away, had wondered once or twice what happened. But he buried that curiosity under work, ambition, and cold certainty. If she really needed him, she would have come back. That was his excuse. That was the lie he fed himself for years. He never told anyone about her. Not his assistant, not his board, not even the therapist he saw once during a brief, silent burnout. It was as if Hannah Mason had never existed in his world. Until one evening, sitting in a dark hotel bar after closing a European merger, he looked down at his phone and saw a missed call from a number he didn't recognize. He ignored it. Then another call came in. Still the same number. He almost let it go to voicemail again, until something, an instinct maybe, made him answer. The voice on the other end was small, a child, a girl. "Hello, is this Andrew Lawson?" His chest tightened. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Emma. You don't know me, but I'm your daughter." The world stopped. He didn't speak, couldn't. The girl took a shaky breath and continued. "My mom, Hannah, she's in the hospital. She had an accident. The doctors said she's in the ICU. They needed an adult, and you're the only one I could think of." It was the first time in years Andrew Lawson felt something pierce through the walls he had built. Panic, regret, and something else that he couldn't name. But it felt a lot like everything he had tried to forget crashing down all at once. He stood up, heart racing, and without another word left the bar and walked straight toward the airport. His life, and his silence, finally breaking open. The flight back to New York felt endless, though in reality it was barely 5 hours. Andrew sat alone in a private cabin, untouched drink in hand, staring blankly at the window where there was nothing to see but night sky and 1,000 imagined versions of what might be waiting for him on the other side. He didn't sleep. He didn't speak. He barely moved. Every thought circled around the voice on the phone. The small, brave voice of a girl who had called him Dad like it was a word she wasn't used to saying out loud. He could still hear her breathing, still feel the tremor in her words when she said, "You're the only one I could think of." By the time he landed, it was nearly 2 in the morning. A black car waited for him at the gate, but the city outside the tinted windows felt foreign, cold, like a life he had lived in another skin. The hospital wasn't far, but the drive felt stretched. Every red light a new opportunity for his mind to throw him into yet another wave of guilt. He didn't know what to expect when he arrived. He didn't know what to say. All he knew was that if Hannah didn't survive, if this child truly was his, then he would never forgive himself for what he had abandoned. At the emergency entrance, a nurse met him. "You're here for Hannah Mason?" she asked. He nodded, and she gestured for him to follow. "She's still in critical condition. Stable, for now. Internal bleeding, broken ribs, punctured lung. They're monitoring her through the night. She's sedated, but you can sit with her if you want." He hesitated for only a second. Then, "What about her daughter?" The nurse's eyes softened. "She's in the waiting area, been there for hours. She didn't want to leave her mom's side, but we insisted she lie down. She's 6. Very polite, very brave." The hallway lights flickered softly as they walked. The hospital was quiet, almost eerily so, the kind of quiet that carried its own weight. When the nurse pointed him toward the waiting room, Andrew stopped in the doorway. There, curled up on a too small vinyl bench, was a little girl. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a loose braid, probably done by one of the nurses. Her blue eyes, the same icy blue he saw every morning in the mirror, were half closed. But she sat up the moment she heard footsteps. Her stuffed bunny sat in her lap, worn and clearly well loved. She looked at him, no fear, just cautious interest. "You're him," she said softly, as if confirming it to herself. "You're Andrew Lawson." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm your—" "You don't have to say it," she cut in gently, "I already know." Andrew took a few steps closer, and crouched down so they were at eye level. He could see now that her features weren't just similar, they were unmistakably his. The same angular cheekbones, the same eyebrows, the same look of quiet calculation, even at such a young age. But there was something else, something warmer, that belonged only to Hannah. "Emma," he said, trying her name aloud for the first time. "That's your name?" She nodded, hugging the bunny tighter. "Mommy told me. About you, not much, just that you were busy. And that it wasn't your fault." That hit him harder than any accusation would have. "She told you that." "She said you probably weren't ready," Emma said. "But she never said bad things. I think she didn't want me to hate you." Andrew looked down, then back at her. "You don't?" Emma shrugged in a way that looked far too grown up. "I don't know you yet." There was nothing he could say to that. She was right. He had no place in her world yet. No history, no memories, no moments. Just absence. But he was here now. And even if it was far too late, even if Hannah never woke up to see him again, he couldn't walk away from this little girl, with his eyes, and her mother's heart. "I want to stay," he said quietly. "If that's okay with you." Emma looked at him for a long time, then gave a single, small nod. "You can sit with her. She's been asleep a long time." He stood and followed the nurse to the ICU. The room was dim, filled with the low beeping of machines and the sterile scent of antiseptic. Hannah lay still, pale and fragile beneath the layers of wires and tubes. It didn't look like her. But it was her. Andrew sat down beside her, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. He reached for hers, hesitant, then finally rested his palm over her fingers. Her skin was cool, delicate, but alive. He leaned in and whispered, "I'm here, I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry." She didn't move. The machines went on beeping. He sat there for hours, not speaking again, just holding her hand, as if trying to pour into it all the years of silence he now wished he could take back. Outside the room, Emma waited. She didn't cry. She just kept looking at the door, as if expecting the moment it would open and her mother would walk out, smiling like nothing had happened. But Emma knew better. She was 6. And she had already learned how to wait for people who leave to come back. This time, she only hoped one of them would stay. Morning light began to creep through the narrow hospital windows, painting the sterile white walls in a soft, golden hue. The first signs of dawn broke through the long, dark silence of the night. But Andrew hadn't moved from Hannah's bedside. His suit jacket was draped over the back of the chair, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, and the skin under his eyes had grown dark from exhaustion. He had spent the entire night watching her breathe, counting the slow rise and fall of her chest, listening to the quiet symphony of machines keeping her alive. Every beep, every shift in her pulse on the monitor, had him on edge. This wasn't a world he understood. Here, power meant nothing, influence meant nothing. All he could do was sit, wait, and hope she would open her eyes again. A quiet knock came from the doorframe. He turned and saw Emma, still holding her bunny, standing there barefoot with a nurse behind her. Her clothes were wrinkled from sleep, and her hair stuck out in every direction, but she looked at him steadily, her blue eyes unblinking. The nurse spoke gently, saying that Emma had asked to see her mom. Andrew stood quickly and offered his seat without thinking, but Emma shook her head and instead walked over to him. She didn't say anything, just reached up and took his hand, as if they had done it 1,000 times before. "I don't want to sit," she whispered. "I just want to stand next to her." So together they stood, father and daughter, watching the woman who had connected them both in the most painful and beautiful way imaginable. Emma didn't cry. She didn't flinch at the wires or the bandages. She just stood very still, holding Andrew's hand like it was the only anchor she had left. After a while, the nurse gently guided her out of the room again, promising her pancakes if she came to the cafeteria. Emma looked back once at her mother, then disappeared down the hallway. Andrew didn't follow her this time. Instead, he finally allowed himself to collapse back into the chair. The silence in the room returned, but it felt heavier now, almost suffocating. His thoughts spun relentlessly. What if Hannah never woke up? What if Emma had no one left? Could he? Would he? Be enough for her? And if Hannah did wake up, what would she even want from him? Forgiveness? Distance? Nothing at all? He realized how little he truly knew about the woman lying unconscious beside him. He had known parts of her once. Her laugh, the way she used to sing while cooking, how she always had a plant she was trying not to kill. But he didn't know who she had become in the 6 years since he last saw her. Who had she become as a mother? What dreams had she let go of? What had she built in his absence? And why had she never tried to find him? That question sat deepest of all. Later that day the doctor finally came in. Andrew stood immediately, his heart in his throat. The man was calm, professional and cautious. He explained that Hannah's condition had stabilized, but she remained in a coma. No brain damage was evident on the scans, but they didn't know when, or if, she would wake up. It could be hours, days, weeks, there was no telling. The doctor left, and Andrew sat back down, trying to breathe. She was alive, but she wasn't here. And until she returned, he was standing on a fault line between 2 lives. One where he was a distant, emotionally detached CEO, who had made all the right moves on paper. And one where he had a daughter. A woman he had broken, and a chance to become someone else entirely. He left the room only once that afternoon, to sit with Emma in the hospital's tiny garden courtyard. She sat cross-legged on a bench, her bunny tucked into her lap, nibbling on a granola bar the nurse had given her. She glanced at him once, then back at the flowers in silence. After a few minutes, she said quietly, "I think she's still in there." Andrew turned to her, unsure what she meant. "Mom," Emma continued, "even if she's not talking yet, she always knows when I'm near. She used to say that's how love works. It's like light. You don't always see where it's coming from, but it makes everything warm. Andrew swallowed hard, unsure if he could hold himself together, under the weight of that simple wisdom. This little girl had grown up with warmth he had never learned to give, and somehow, she hadn't lost it. "You're very smart," he said, struggling to find the right words. She looked at him again. "So are you. But I think you forgot." He didn't know whether to laugh or cry, maybe both. They sat like that until the shadows stretched long across the pavement. When she leaned her head against his arm and yawned, he wrapped his arm around her carefully, unsure if it was allowed, unsure if he was worthy. But she didn't pull away. That night he found a small hotel near the hospital, not a 5-star suite, but a quiet place where he could think. He didn't sleep much. Instead, he opened his laptop and began reading everything he could find on children's custody, guardianship, and trauma recovery. He made calls, private doctors, legal teams, child psychologists, not to fix something, not this time, but to be ready for whatever came next. For the first time in his life, Andrew Lawson didn't want control. He just wanted to be present. He just wanted her to wake up. 3 days passed. The hospital became a strange sort of home, sterile and unfamiliar but now etched into Andrew's every waking thought. Each morning he arrived early, quietly slipping into Hannah's ICU room before the nurses changed her IVs or checked her vitals. He sat in the same chair, holding her hand, talking to her in low, steady tones. He spoke about anything he could think of, memories from their time together, the way Emma smiled in her sleep, the weather. Even what he'd eaten for lunch the day before. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he believed that maybe somewhere, buried beneath the silence, she was listening. That belief kept him going. Emma adapted faster than he expected. She had always been an adaptable child. Hannah had clearly raised her to be strong and independent. But there was something heartbreaking in how easily she fell into this new routine. She didn't ask when they were going home. She didn't cry when nurses inserted new tubes into her mother's arm. She simply observed, learned the names of every machine in the room, and waited. That waiting aged her in a way Andrew hadn't anticipated. She was only 6, but she held herself like someone who had already experienced more than most adults. One afternoon, while they were in the hospital cafeteria, Emma sat across from him, with her chocolate milk untouched, and her eyes fixed on a crumpled paper napkin she was folding into a strange shape. After a long pause, she said without looking up, "You're different than I imagined." He looked at her, surprised. "Different how?" "I thought you'd be mean," she said simply. "Mom always said you were strong, but I thought that meant cold." Andrew wanted to argue, but what would he say? That he wasn't cold? That he hadn't walked away when Hannah needed him most? He couldn't lie to this child who had done nothing to deserve half-truths. So instead he nodded. "I was cold. For a long time." Emma finally looked at him, as if studying him for signs of weakness or honesty. "Are you still?" He considered the question. "Not when I'm with you." She seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to folding the napkin. A few minutes later, she pushed it across the table. "It's a bird. You're supposed to make a wish and set it free." "What did you wish for?" he asked her gently. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That she wakes up." Later that evening, while Andrew sat beside Hannah again, the doctor entered with a clipboard. His face was unreadable, which always meant something complicated. "We're going to try reducing the sedation tonight," he explained. "See if her brain starts responding on its own. It's a slow process, but it's the first real step toward recovery." Andrew sat motionless, processing the information. "So, she might wake up?" "Possibly. We can't guarantee how quickly. But we're optimistic." Optimism wasn't a word Andrew had let himself believe in for a long time. He thanked the doctor, and stayed even later than usual, staring at Hannah's still face, and wondering what she would say when her eyes opened. Would she be angry? Scared? Would she want him gone, despite everything he had tried to do since the accident? He didn't know. But he was willing to face it. That night, after walking Emma back to the guest room the nurses had set up for her, She asked something he hadn't expected. "If she doesn't wake up, do I stay with you?" The question struck like a punch to the chest. He knelt beside her, searching her eyes. "Do you want to?" She hesitated. "I don't know. I don't really know you. But I don't want to go to strangers." "You'll never have to," he said immediately. "I promise you that. No matter what happens, I'll be here. You're not alone." She nodded slowly, but didn't say anything else. That night, when Andrew returned to the hotel, he contacted his lawyers and began preparing for guardianship. He didn't know how long Hannah would be unconscious, but he needed to be ready. Not because it was legally required, but because Emma needed someone, and he wanted to be that someone. Not out of guilt anymore, but out of choice. The next morning, when he returned to the ICU, something was different. The room was quieter. The nurses were standing still. And Hannah, her eyes were open. Not fully focused, not entirely aware, but open. Andrew didn't breathe for a full 10 seconds. Then one of her fingers twitched under his hand. "Hannah," he said, his voice hoarse and trembling. Her lips moved slightly, barely a sound escaping, but the effort was there. A murmur, a breath. She was coming back. And for the first time in years, Andrew Lawson felt something close to hope take root in the wreckage of his past. The days following Hannah's awakening were fragile and delicate, as if the entire world had shifted onto a thin sheet of glass that might crack under the weight of the wrong word or gesture. Her eyes, though open, were slow to adjust, not just to light or movement, but to the reality she had re-entered. It took time before she could speak in full sentences. The first days were filled with whispered questions, soft blinking, confusion, and quiet tears that slipped down her temples when no one thought she noticed. Her body had endured trauma, but her spirit had as well. And the sight of Andrew sitting by her bedside, day after day, watching over her and their daughter, seemed to confuse her more than anything else. The first time they were alone, she turned her head slightly and looked at him for a long time. Her voice rasped and nearly inaudible. "Why are you here?" He didn't answer right away. There was no easy sentence that could explain what had changed in him. "Emma called me," he said finally. "She told me what happened. I got on the first flight back." Her eyes searched his face for some trace of the man she remembered. "You didn't come for 6 years," she whispered, her voice thick and raw. "I know," he said. "And I was wrong. About everything." She looked away. "I didn't tell you. I should have, but I didn't. I was afraid of what you'd say. Of how you'd look at her." "I don't blame you," he said. "I gave you no reason to trust me. I was scared then. I thought love was a liability. I thought children would break the life I'd built. I was wrong." She blinked slowly, the corners of her mouth trembling, though no emotion fully formed. "She's everything," she whispered. "I know that now," he replied. For days after, their conversations remained careful, cautious, as if walking over old glass. Andrew stayed at the hospital, even when she told him he didn't need to. He brought Emma every morning and took her home every evening. He asked for nothing in return, no absolution, no permission. Just the chance to be near. Emma's presence helped Hannah heal in a way no medication could. Her laughter in the hospital corridors. The little songs she sang while drawing pictures at the edge of her mother's bed. Her way of explaining to the nurses what every button on the IV machine was for. These moments pulled Hannah back to life with surprising speed. But it was her comfort around Andrew that startled Hannah most. Emma would reach for his hand, crawl into his lap without prompting, even rest her head against his shoulder like she had always belonged there. And maybe, without realizing it, she had. One evening, after Emma had fallen asleep in the corner of the room with her bunny pressed under her chin, Hannah turned to Andrew. Her voice was stronger now, though still quiet. "She trusts you." "I'm still learning how to deserve that," he answered. "She talks about you like you've always been here." "I think she wanted me to be, even before she knew who I was." Hannah didn't speak for a while. She stared at Emma, watching her chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of sleep. "She's strong," she said eventually. But it's not fair that she had to be. Andrew nodded, swallowing hard. I want to make it right. Not with words, not with promises, just time, effort, showing up. Hannah turned her head toward him, and for the first time since she'd woken up, her expression softened, less guarded. You're not the man I left behind. I'm trying not to be. She gave a small nod, as if accepting that for now. Over the next few weeks, Hannah slowly transitioned out of the ICU. Andrew helped organize her physical therapy, consulted with doctors, hired a private in-home nurse for when she was discharged, and never once asked to take over. He didn't swoop in with grand gestures. He simply stayed, a steady presence. One day Hannah returned home, the first time she walked through the door of her modest apartment, her legs shaking. Emma clung to her waist and said, "Now it feels like home again." Hannah cried for the first time since the accident. Andrew didn't move back in. He didn't suggest it, but he was there almost every morning. He made breakfast, he drove Emma to school. He helped Hannah dress when her joints ached too much to manage on her own. He sat on the floor and built puzzles with Emma, even though he had never touched one before. He folded laundry. He learned how Hannah liked her coffee. Slowly, carefully he wove himself into their daily life, not as an outsider demanding a place, but as someone humbly asking to earn it. People around them noticed, neighbors, teachers, even Hannah's mother, who had visited once with suspicion in her eyes, now watched Andrew with quiet respect. He wasn't there out of obligation. He was there out of devotion. One quiet night, weeks after her return home, Hannah found herself sitting beside him on the small back patio. The stars above were soft and pale, and the air smelled like lilac. Emma was asleep inside, her laughter still echoing faintly through the screen door. "Do you miss your old life?" Hannah asked him. He didn't have to think. "No. I was lonely, but I didn't know it." She looked at him for a long time. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right? This isn't some temporary fix." "I'm not here to fix," he said. "I'm here to stay." And for the first time, she believed him. Autumn came quietly, the way it always did in New York, slipping in beneath summer's breath, and spreading a cool hush over the city. Trees began shedding their green for gold. The light shifted to something softer, and the wind carried with it the scent of change. For Andrew, the season felt symbolic, as if his life had entered an entirely new chapter, one that didn't revolve around quarterly projections or investment calls, but around school lunches, early mornings with sleepy eyes, and quiet dinners that left the house smelling like cinnamon and baked apples. It was foreign territory, but he welcomed it. Emma had begun to thrive in ways Andrew hadn't even realized were possible. Her drawings became more colorful, her laughter more frequent, her trust more visible. She no longer looked for his approval, as if testing it. She simply assumed it was there. One Saturday morning she climbed into bed between him and Hannah, with her bunny and a handful of cereal. Her hair a wild mess, and her feet freezing. Neither adult said a word, but when she fell asleep across their legs, Andrew glanced over at Hannah, who only smiled, with tears quietly gathered in her eyes. It was a peace neither of them had thought they'd find again. But peace didn't mean the past had vanished. One afternoon Andrew was called into a parent-teacher meeting. Emma had gotten into an argument with another child, who had made a comment about not having a real dad. The words came from a place of childhood ignorance, not malice, but they had struck something deep inside Emma. She had shouted, pushed a chair, told the boy that her dad was real because he showed up, even when it was hard. Andrew listened as the teacher recounted the incident, a mixture of pride and heartbreak knotting in his stomach. Afterward, as they walked to the car, Emma kicked at leaves without looking up. He knelt beside her, and asked gently if she wanted to talk about it. She was quiet at first, then mumbled, "I know you weren't there before, but I don't want people to think you're not my dad." He took her hand in both of his and said, "Emma, anyone who sees us for 5 seconds will know I'm yours. And I don't care what label they use. I just want to be there for you. Every day. Always. She nodded and hugged him tightly, burying her face in his coat. That hug stayed with him for days. Meanwhile, Hannah was progressing. Her recovery was steady, and the physical therapy helped, but there were setbacks too. She had good days where she joked and cooked and teased Andrew about his horrible folding techniques. And she had days where she couldn't stand up without assistance, and refused to let Emma see her struggle. On those days, Andrew stepped in quietly. He never made her feel small. He just did what needed doing, rubbing her legs, carrying her from room to room, massaging her shoulders, while she pretended to scroll her phone with dry eyes. One evening as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she finally said, "I'm scared I won't be the mother I was before." Andrew sat beside her and shook his head. "You won't be. And that's okay. Because now you're stronger. Emma doesn't need who you were. She needs you now. And I do too." She reached for his hand, and for the first time since her accident, she let herself cry in front of him without trying to turn away. As the holidays approached, Andrew decided to do something small but meaningful. Without telling Hannah, he took Emma to a family photographer and arranged a quiet shoot in Central Park, just the two of them. He wanted Emma to have photos that showed what was true now, not what had been missing before. They spent an afternoon running between trees, tossing leaves, and laughing so hard, Emma got hiccups. When they were done, she climbed onto his shoulders and whispered, "That was the best day of my life." Later, when he presented the framed photos to Hannah, she stared at them for a long time without saying a word. Then she looked up and said, "I don't know what you're trying to become, Andrew." He met her gaze. "I'm not trying to become anything. I'm just finally being who I should have been." She nodded slowly. "Well, you're doing it." They spent Thanksgiving together, just the three of them, in a kitchen filled with warmth and flour and more burned edges than planned. Emma said grace without being asked, thanking the people I love most, even if they're not perfect. Andrew looked at Hannah, and Hannah looked at him, and neither of them laughed. Because somehow, those words had said everything. That night, when Emma was asleep, Andrew and Hannah sat in the living room, sharing a blanket and a bottle of wine. The television played quietly in the background, but neither of them really watched it. After a while, Andrew said, "You know, I used to think happiness was the enemy, that it distracted me from being great." "And now?" Hannah asked softly. "Now I think I spent a long time being great at all the wrong things." She rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence, both knowing that healing didn't always come with closure, and love didn't always come with clarity. But if you kept showing up, day after day, it just might become something solid enough to hold. Winter came early that year, draping the city in a curtain of frost that made the sidewalks shimmer and the windows fog with every breath. The cold had a way of bringing people closer together, pressing them into shared spaces and shared warmth. And for Andrew, it brought a kind of intimacy he hadn't realized he was missing. Inside Hannah's apartment, things were far from perfect. There were still medical bills, Hannah's occasional pain, the strain of co-parenting after years of separation. But there was also laughter again, the smell of soup on the stove, and the sound of Emma's footsteps in fuzzy socks as she ran down the hall calling for both her parents. The world outside was freezing, but their little corner of it felt more alive than ever. Despite the progress, Andrew still lived with an unshakable fear that what he was building might not last. He hadn't asked Hannah for anything permanent yet, though the idea lived quietly in the back of his mind, every time he saw her fall asleep on the couch beside him, or watched Emma draw all three of them into one picture without hesitation. He hadn't earned a future, yet. He was still earning the present, every single day. One night, while Hannah was resting and Emma was asleep, Andrew found himself alone in the kitchen, staring down at a small velvet box he had hidden in the back of the silverware drawer. He had ordered it weeks ago, not because he had a plan, but because something inside him needed to believe the day would come when he could offer it to her. The ring inside was simple, platinum, understated, but designed with care. He hadn't yet touched it beyond opening the box once to make sure it was real. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, he lifted it again, and held it in his palm. Not with the confidence of a CEO used to closing billion-dollar deals, but like a man standing on the edge of something fragile and sacred. He didn't propose that night. He didn't even tell her about the ring. Instead, the next morning, he bundled Emma into her coat and scarf and surprised her with a visit to his office. She had never seen that side of his life before. His assistant, startled at first, quickly rearranged his day when she saw the little girl beside him, beaming with pride. Emma walked through the halls like royalty, greeting employees, inspecting chairs, asking if there was a kids section. Andrew introduced her to everyone, letting them know exactly who she was, no hesitation in his voice. She was his daughter, and today, she was in charge. Later, in his office, she sat behind his desk and scribbled her name on sticky notes while he watched from the doorway. At one point she looked up at him and said, "Was this what you were always doing when you didn't call us?" The question hit him harder than it should have. He crossed the room slowly, sat beside her and said gently, "Yes. I thought I was building something important. But I missed the most important part." Emma nodded as if she understood, then passed him a sticky note with a crooked heart, drawn in pink marker. "You can keep that. So you don't forget." The moment settled into him like a promise. The next big shift came just before Christmas. Hannah caught the flu, and it hit her harder than expected. The fever spiked, her energy dropped, and for a week, Andrew became the center of the household, managing Emma's school, the meals, the medicine schedule, and the endless laundry. He didn't complain. He didn't waver. When Hannah could finally sit upright again, she found him asleep on the floor of the bedroom, wrapped in a blanket, a notepad of appointments and reminders still clutched in his hand. She watched him sleep for a while, and something deep inside her shifted. This wasn't just a man trying to redeem himself anymore. This was a man who had changed, cell by cell, moment by moment, into someone who stayed. On Christmas morning, Emma woke them both before sunrise. She tore through wrapping paper and danced around in her pajamas. But the most unexpected gift came in the form of a small box she handed to Andrew, her name written on it in messy crayon letters. Inside was a braided string bracelet with beads spelling out, "Dad." He didn't even try to stop the tears. He slipped it on his wrist, and promised to never take it off. That night, as the fire in the hearth burned low and the house finally quieted, Andrew and Hannah sat on the couch, sharing the last piece of pie. Neither spoke for a long time, the silence between them full of years they had lost and all they had reclaimed. Eventually, Hannah reached out and took his hand. "I never imagined this," she said softly. He looked at her, eyes steady. "I did. I just never thought I deserved it." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time, he believed she wasn't leaning out of forgiveness or pity, but out of choice. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, something much warmer had already begun. Spring arrived slowly, with shy sunlight that stretched gently across windowsills and melted away the last signs of winter. In Hannah's apartment, the air smelled of fresh flowers, warm toast, and something new. Something that felt like hope, but more grounded, more real. It had been nearly 6 months since the accident, and while some parts of life had returned to a familiar rhythm, other parts had changed in ways no one had expected. Andrew no longer lived in his penthouse. His suits were still in his closet, but they shared space now, with Emma's school art projects, mismatched mugs, and laundry baskets that overflowed, at least once a week. He hadn't abandoned his business, but his priorities had shifted so completely that even his board of directors had noticed. He still made big decisions, but now he made them after school drop-offs, while waiting at ballet practice or from the living room floor with Emma coloring beside him. There was still no official title between him and Hannah, no declarations or labels, but the closeness between them had become undeniable. They moved around each other effortlessly, making coffee for the other without asking, folding each other's laundry, reaching for the same blanket during movie nights. They were a family, even if no one had said the word out loud, and perhaps that silence was part of what made it feel sacred. One morning in April, Andrew woke before the sun. The city was still quiet outside, and inside the apartment was filled with the soft sounds of early life. Emma's gentle snoring down the hall, the refrigerator humming, the wind brushing against the windows. He sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in one hand, the small velvet box in the other. He had carried it with him all this time, waiting, not for the perfect moment, but for the true one. Later that day, he told Emma he needed her help with something important. She grinned immediately, sensing that it wasn't a regular errand. Together they spent the afternoon baking Hannah's favorite pie, burning the first attempt and laughing through the second. Emma made a card using colored pencils and glitter glue. She wrote, "You're my favorite person," in large, uneven letters, and drew 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a sun. Andrew placed the ring box inside the pie box, tied it with a ribbon, and tried to calm the nerves that had built quietly in his chest all week. That evening, when Hannah came home from a doctor's appointment, she was met with the smell of warm apples, vanilla, and cinnamon. Emma dragged her to the living room and announced, "Surprise! We made something for you." "Well, he did most of it. I just bossed him around." Hannah laughed, eyes shining. She opened the box slowly, expecting dessert, and then froze. Inside, nestled between 2 folded napkins, was the small black box she hadn't seen before. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out, opened the lid, and saw the ring glimmering beneath the soft lighting. Andrew stood up, gently taking her hand. Emma stood beside them, holding her bunny with both arms, barely breathing. Andrew didn't kneel. He didn't need to. His voice was steady but full of emotion as he said, "I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't know how to be a partner. I didn't know how to stay when things got hard. But you taught me. You both taught me. I've already had everything I ever wanted in this house, in this life, with you. But I want to make it official. I want to be your family. If you'll have me." Hannah looked from the ring to Andrew, then down to Emma, who whispered, "Please say yes." And she did. Through tears, through laughter, through a kind of disbelief that this man, the one she had once left behind, was now the one standing in front of her, asking to build something permanent. She said yes. The weeks that followed were filled with joy, with planning that wasn't about grandeur but about meaning. They held a small ceremony in the same garden where Andrew had once sat with Emma and promised her she would never be alone. This time, she walked down the aisle with Hannah on one side and Andrew on the other, her little hand in both of theirs. Friends and neighbors, nurses and teachers, even Andrew's stunned business partners gathered to witness what love looks like when it is rebuilt brick by brick. During his vows, Andrew didn't speak about love in big poetic phrases. He simply promised to keep showing up, to keep learning, to keep earning the right to be theirs. And when they exchanged rings, Emma clapped so hard she knocked over her juice cup and didn't even notice. That night, as they returned home, Hannah stood in the kitchen watching Andrew and Emma clean up the last of the cake crumbs. She leaned against the doorframe, one hand on her chest, the other wrapped around a mug of tea, and thought to herself that maybe life didn't always unfold the way you planned. Maybe it started with heartbreak, with silence, with mistakes, but if you listened closely, if you stayed soft when you wanted to run, if you waited long enough, sometimes it ended in a kind of joy you never saw coming. She walked over and wrapped her arms around them both. And this time, none of them ever let go. As the author, I believe the ending of this story reflects the kind of healing that doesn't come from grand gestures, but from quiet, consistent love, the kind that grows through brokenness rather than avoiding it. Andrew's transformation wasn't instant, or easy, and that's what makes it meaningful. He didn't return to be a hero. He returned to take responsibility, and in doing so he learned how to be a father, a partner, and finally, a whole person. This story isn't just about redemption. It's about second chances, and the courage it takes to accept them. It's about a woman who didn't wait to be saved, a child who never stopped believing in love, and a man who finally chose presence over power. The ending isn't perfect, and that's the point. It's real. And sometimes real love is the most powerful kind of ending we can write.
Alexander Grayson had built an empire on discipline and control. Nothing in his world happened by chance. Every decision was calculated, every risk measured. But all of that shattered the moment two identical boys stepped in front of him, their bright blue eyes locked onto his. "You're Alexander Grayson, right?" one of them asked. Before he could respond, the second boy spoke, his voice calm, certain. "We've been looking for you." Alexander frowned, his instincts immediately on alert. "Why?" The first boy hesitated for only a second before delivering the words that would change everything. "Because you're our dad." Alexander Grayson stepped out of his towering office building, his mind already focused on the next deal waiting for him. The sharp evening air did little to distract him from the numbers running through his head, the negotiations he needed to finalize, and the endless demands of his company. He thrived in control, in structure, in the power that came with knowing he was the one calling the shots. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, barely noticing the people passing by. He wasn't a man who paid attention to the world around him unless it directly impacted his business. But something made him stop that evening. A strange feeling crept over him, an instinct he couldn't quite explain. Someone was watching him. His sharp blue eyes scanned the busy sidewalk, expecting to find a journalist, an employee who didn't have the courage to approach him, maybe even a competitor sizing him up. Instead, he saw them. Two boys stood a few feet away, identical in every way. They couldn't have been older than 7, with neatly combed blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, the same shade as his own. They wore matching jackets, their hands stuffed into their pockets as they stared at him with an expression that sent an unexpected chill through his spine. Alexander felt his stomach tighten, though he wasn't sure why. He had seen many strange things in his life, but nothing like this. The two boys exchanged a glance before one of them, the slightly taller one, took a hesitant step forward. "Are you Alexander Grayson?" His name sounded strange coming from such a small voice. It was a question, but there was no uncertainty in it. The boy already knew the answer. Alexander straightened his posture, his business instincts kicking in. He had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but he had never been a man caught off guard for long. "Yes," he answered carefully. "Who are you?" The second boy stepped closer, his hands still deep in his pockets. He studied Alexander in a way no child ever had before, as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was. Then, with a calmness that didn't belong to someone so young, he said, "We've been looking for you." Alexander's entire body tensed. Something about their tone, about the way they stood so still, made his heartbeat pick up slightly. He had spent years perfecting the art of reading people, anticipating their moves before they even made them. But he couldn't read these boys. "And why is that?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The first boy hesitated before answering. "Because you're our dad." For the first time in years, Alexander Grayson had no words. The weight of the words hung in the air, thick and heavy, as Alexander stared at the two boys standing in front of him. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, struggled to process what had just been said. He had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating deals worth billions, outmaneuvering competitors, and making decisions that shaped entire industries. Yet, in this moment, he found himself completely unprepared. The boys didn't flinch under his intense gaze. There was no hesitation in their posture, no trace of uncertainty in their expressions. They weren't confused, scared, or nervous. They simply stood there, waiting for his response, as if they had rehearsed this moment 100 times before. Alexander cleared his throat, forcing himself to regain control, but his voice still came out rougher than he intended. "That's not possible," he said, shaking his head slightly, as if doing so would somehow change reality. "You must be mistaken." The slightly taller boy, the one who had spoken first, tilted his head slightly, his blue eyes never leaving Alexander's face. "We're not mistaken," he said calmly, as if he had already prepared for this exact reaction. "Our mom told us about you." At the mention of their mother, something cold settled in Alexander's stomach. He didn't need to ask who she was. He already knew. There had only been one woman in his life who had ever truly mattered, one woman who had slipped through his fingers before he even realized what he had lost. Lauren Harris. The name burned at the edges of his mind, bringing with it memories he had buried deep beneath the relentless pursuit of his career. He had met her before his company had become an empire, before his name had carried the weight it did now. She had been the only person who had ever looked at him as more than a businessman, the only one who had made him feel something beyond ambition. And he had let her go. His jaw tightened as he forced himself to focus on the present, on the two boys who were still waiting for him to say something. He wanted to deny it outright, to tell them they had the wrong man, that this was some ridiculous mistake, but the moment he looked at them again, he knew he couldn't. The resemblance was too strong. The blonde hair, the sharp features, the piercing blue eyes that mirrored his own, it was undeniable. His pulse pounded in his ears as he inhaled deeply, his voice quieter now. "Where is your mother?" The second boy, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice softer but just as steady. "She's in the hospital," he said, his fingers tightening around the edge of his jacket. "She's sick." Alexander felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, controlled exhale, but it did nothing to ease the sudden tightness in his chest. Lauren was in the hospital. She had never reached out, never told him about them, never given him the chance to know that he had two sons. She had kept them away from him for 7 years, had raised them without him, had built a life that didn't include him, and now she was sick. His voice was measured when he spoke again, though it took everything in him to keep it steady. "Take me to her." The boys exchanged a glance, as if communicating without words, before nodding in unison. They turned without hesitation, leading him down the street, their movements in perfect sync, as if they had spent their entire lives preparing for this exact moment. Alexander followed, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he was ready to hear the answers to. The drive to the hospital was silent, but the air inside the car was thick with unspoken tension. Alexander sat behind the wheel, gripping it tighter than necessary, his knuckles white from the pressure. His mind raced through every possibility, every unanswered question that had surfaced the moment the boys had spoken their mother's name. He wanted to demand answers, to ask them how long she had been sick, why she had never told him about them, why she had chosen to raise them alone rather than come to him. But he held back, knowing that pressing them now wouldn't do any good. The boys sat in the back, side by side, their movements eerily in sync. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't seem particularly nervous. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear or uncertainty. It was more like they were waiting, as if they already knew how this was going to play out and had accepted it long before he had even known they existed. The hospital came into view, its white walls and bright lights a stark contrast to the darkness settling in the sky above. Alexander pulled into the parking lot, his pulse pounding as he turned off the engine. He had been in hospitals before, but always for business meetings with investors, charitable donations, or ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new medical wings his company had funded. Never for something that mattered. Never for something personal. The boys unbuckled their seat belts and climbed out of the car without hesitation. Alexander followed, his steps feeling heavier than they should as he walked toward the entrance. Inside, the hospital smelled like antiseptic and sterilized air, the kind of scent that clung to everything. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as they made their way through the corridors. The boys led him with an ease that suggested they had done this many times before, weaving through the hallways with a sense of familiarity that made his chest tighten. When they reached a door near the end of the hall, one of the boys, he still hadn't learned which was which, paused and looked up at him. "She's tired a lot," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Sometimes she's asleep." Alexander nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him when they stepped inside. Lauren was lying in the hospital bed, her body thinner than he remembered, her face pale but still unmistakably hers. The vibrant, fiery woman he had once known looked fragile now, her dark blonde hair slightly disheveled against the stark white pillow. Her eyes were closed, her breathing even but weak. For a moment, he couldn't move. He had spent years convincing himself that she had left because she hadn't wanted the life he had chosen. He had told himself that she had walked away because she had never truly loved him, that she had seen the man he was becoming and had decided she didn't want to be a part of it. But now, looking at her lying there, he realized how little he had truly understood. The boys moved to the side of the bed, one of them reaching for her hand, his small fingers curling around hers with a familiarity that made Alexander's chest tighten. Lauren stirred at the touch, her eyelids fluttering open slowly. Her green eyes, still as striking as ever, focused on the boys first, and she offered them a tired but warm smile. Then, her gaze shifted, and the moment she saw him standing there, her entire body tensed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she said his name. Alexander. His throat felt dry when he finally found his voice. You should have told me. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. He took a step closer, his pulse hammering. 7 years, Lauren. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, steady, filled with the weight of everything he had just learned. 7 years, and you never told me I had sons. Lauren's fingers twitched against the sheets, her expression shifting, something unreadable flickering in her tired eyes. I wanted to, she admitted, her voice hoarse. I almost did, so many times. Then why didn't you? She exhaled shakily, her gaze dropping to the bed before looking back up at him. Because I thought you wouldn't want them. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Alexander inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He had expected excuses, justifications, maybe even anger. He hadn't expected this. Lauren swallowed hard. You had your company, your empire, everything you worked for. I didn't want to be the one who held you back. His hands curled into fists at his sides. You think I wouldn't have wanted them? His voice was lower now, rougher. You think I would have turned my back on my own children? Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. I didn't know, Alexander. I didn't know if you could ever be anything other than the man who put work before everything. He felt something crack inside him, something he had spent years carefully holding together. I had a right to know, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. Lauren let out a breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. I know. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. The boys, who had remained quiet the entire time, exchanged a glance before looking back at their mother. We found him, one of them said softly. Like you told us to. Alexander frowned slightly, turning to look at them. What do you mean? Lauren closed her eyes for a brief moment before meeting his gaze again. I told them, if anything ever happened to me, they should go to you. His heart clenched. You were always going to tell them? She nodded. When they were older. When I was sure they wouldn't feel like a burden to you. He stared at her, struggling to comprehend how she could have believed such a thing. They are not a burden, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And neither are you. Lauren blinked, her breath hitching slightly, as if she hadn't expected those words. Alexander exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face before looking at the boys again. He had spent his entire life making decisions that shaped industries, controlling the outcome of everything he touched. But this? This was the one thing he had never seen coming. Yet, as he stood in that hospital room, looking at the two boys who had sought him out, at the woman who had once meant everything to him, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away. Not this time. The weight of the moment pressed down on Alexander as he sat in the hospital room, the beeping of machines and the distant murmur of voices in the hallway fading into background noise. His world had just shifted in a way he never could have predicted, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to do next. Lauren lay back against the pillows, looking exhausted but alert. Her green eyes held a mixture of emotions, regret, uncertainty, and something else he couldn't quite define. The boys sat on either side of her bed, their small hands resting on the blanket as if they could somehow protect her just by being close. Alexander exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. He had come here demanding answers, but now that he had them, he wasn't sure what to do with them. The past couldn't be rewritten. The 7 years he had missed with his sons were lost forever. But there was still the present, still the future, and for the first time, he realized that walking away wasn't an option. Lauren spoke first, her voice quieter than before. "What are you thinking?" He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. "That I don't even know where to start." She gave him a tired, almost sad smile. "Neither do I." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they hadn't said in years. Finally, he turned to the boys. They were watching him carefully, their expressions unreadable, but there was curiosity in their eyes. He had spent his life reading people, predicting their next moves, but he couldn't read his own sons. "You knew about me?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The taller of the two, who seemed to be the more confident one, nodded. "Mom told us your name. She showed us pictures." His chest tightened. "And you still came looking for me?" The second boy, who had been quieter so far, lifted his chin slightly. "You were supposed to find us." The words hit him harder than he expected. Lauren sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I never wanted them to feel like they didn't have a father," she admitted. "I wanted them to know who you were. I thought I had more time to figure out how to tell you." Alexander clenched his jaw, suppressing the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that he had been kept in the dark or the realization that his sons had spent years believing he had chosen not to find them. He turned back to them. "I didn't know," he said, his voice firm. "If I had, I would have been here." The boys exchanged a glance, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Alexander knew trust wouldn't come easily. He had spent years building an empire, but now he was starting from scratch in something far more important. "I want to make up for the time I lost," he said, looking at both of them. "If you'll let me." Lauren's eyes softened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to say that. One of the boys shifted in his seat. "What does that mean?" Alexander inhaled slowly, measuring his words. "It means I don't want to just disappear now that I know about you. It means I want to be in your lives." The boys didn't respond right away. They were thinking, processing. Lauren cleared her throat. "I don't know how long I'll be in here, but they need someone to take care of them." Alexander straightened. "Then they'll come with me." The statement was so firm, so final, that even Lauren looked surprised. "You mean that?" she asked. He met her gaze. "They're my sons, Lauren. I'm not leaving them." For the first time, one of the boys smiled, small, cautious, but real. The other still looked unsure, but he didn't protest. Lauren let out a slow breath, nodding. "Okay." Alexander looked at the boys again. "Is that okay with you?" They both studied him for a moment before the taller one nodded. "Yeah." His brother hesitated a second longer, then nodded too. Alexander felt something shift inside him. He had spent his whole life building walls, keeping emotions at bay, convincing himself that he didn't need anything more than his success. But now, for the first time, he realized he had been missing something far more important. And he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers again. Alexander had spent years making decisions with absolute confidence. He had built a business empire from the ground up, faced ruthless competitors, and negotiated some of the most complex deals in the industry. But nothing had prepared him for this, driving 2 7-year-old boys to his home, knowing that from this moment forward, nothing in his life would ever be the same. The ride was quiet. The twins sat in the back seat, their small faces illuminated by the soft glow of passing streetlights. They weren't fidgeting, nor did they speak much, but they were watching him. Observing. Studying him the same way he had studied boardroom rivals for years. Alexander wasn't sure if it was unsettling or impressive. His house was a stark contrast to the hospital they had just left. The sleek glass walls, modern furniture, and spotless floors reflected a life built for a man who had never planned on sharing his space with anyone. The boys stepped inside cautiously, their heads tilting upward as they took in the massive ceilings and expensive artwork. One of them, the more talkative one, broke the silence first. "You live here alone?" Alexander nodded, setting his keys on the marble counter. "Yes." The other twin, quieter but just as observant, glanced at his brother before looking back at Alexander. "It's really big." Alexander didn't know how to respond to that. He had never thought about his house in terms of size, only function. It was a space designed for efficiency, not comfort, and certainly not for children. He turned toward them. "Are you hungry?" The twins exchanged another glance before the talkative one nodded. "A little." Alexander exhaled, walking toward the kitchen. He had no idea what kids ate. His own meals were prepared by staff or ordered in, designed for convenience rather than enjoyment. He opened the fridge and frowned at its contents: bottled water, high-protein meals, and a few untouched fruits. He glanced back at them. "What do you usually eat?" The quieter twin finally spoke. "Mom made pancakes for dinner sometimes." Alexander hesitated. "Pancakes?" The first twin nodded. "She said breakfast food tastes better at night." For a moment, Alexander didn't move. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the simplicity of their answer caught him off guard. He had spent the last few hours trying to figure out how to introduce himself into their lives, how to prove he belonged, how to fix the years he had lost. And now, standing in his own kitchen, he realized the answer might be as simple as pancakes. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and searched for a recipe. He wasn't the type to cook, he had never needed to, but he could follow instructions. The boys watched as he gathered ingredients, measuring out flour and cracking eggs into a bowl with calculated precision. The first twin climbed onto one of the bar stools, resting his chin on his hand. "You don't cook much, do you?" Alexander smirked slightly, stirring the batter. "What gave it away?" The other twin, still standing, shrugged. "You look like you're making a business deal with the eggs." For the first time all day, Alexander let out a genuine laugh. It was short, unexpected, and completely foreign to him. But it was real. The twins grinned, as if pleased with themselves for getting that reaction out of him. When the pancakes were finally done, he set the plates in front of them and waited. The first twin took a bite and nodded. "Not bad." The second took a more thoughtful approach, chewing slowly before looking up. "Not as good as Mom's." Alexander smirked. "I figured." They ate in comfortable silence, the first real moment of normalcy since everything had changed. The boys weren't as tense as before, their guard lowering slightly with each bite. After a while, one of them looked up. "Are we staying here now?" Alexander met his gaze. "For as long as you want." The other twin, usually the quieter one, studied him carefully. "Do you want us here?" The question caught him off guard. He didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't used to saying things that weren't carefully measured and controlled. Finally, he set down his fork and met both of their gazes. "Yes." The boys didn't say anything right away, but something shifted. The tension in their shoulders eased just a little. They didn't fully trust him yet. He knew that would take time. But at least now, they believed him. The first night with the twins in his home was unlike anything Alexander had ever experienced. His house, once filled only with the hum of electronics and the occasional clink of glassware from late-night drinks, now carried the soft sounds of two 7-year-olds moving through unfamiliar space. The twins didn't talk much after dinner. They explored the house cautiously, as if unsure whether they truly belonged here, and Alexander found himself watching them more than he intended. It was strange, the way they carried themselves. There was no wild energy, no reckless curiosity that he expected from kids their age. They were careful, thoughtful, observant in a way that made it clear they had learned to read people long before they should have needed to. They reminded him of himself, always analyzing, always waiting to see how a situation might unfold before committing to it. He showed them to the guest rooms, identical in layout but different in decor. He hadn't expected them to hesitate, hadn't expected the look they exchanged when he motioned toward the separate rooms. It wasn't until the quieter twin shifted uncomfortably that Alexander realized what was wrong. "We usually share a room," the boy admitted, his voice quieter than before. The other twin nodded. "Mom said it made us stronger. That way, we were never alone." Something tightened in Alexander's chest at those words, but he didn't let it show. Without hesitation, he gestured toward one of the rooms. "Then you can stay together here. I'll have the other one changed in case you ever want your own space." The boys seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding in unison. As they stepped inside, Alexander hesitated at the doorway. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to say something, wasn't sure what the right words were. He had never put anyone to bed before. He had never needed to. "Do you need anything?" he finally asked, feeling unfamiliar with the question even as he spoke it. The taller twin shook his head. The quieter one hesitated before asking, "Is it okay if we leave the door open?" Alexander nodded without hesitation. "Of course." They climbed into bed, still fully dressed, and Alexander made a mental note to buy them proper clothes in the morning. He reached for the light switch, then paused. "Good night." The twins looked at him for a long moment before one of them finally muttered, "Good night." Alexander stepped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, and walked down the hall to his own bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together as he stared at the floor. His entire life had changed in a matter of hours. He had gone from being a man who had everything under control to standing in the middle of his own house, wondering how to be a father to two boys who had spent their lives without him. There was no contract to sign, no negotiation to make this easier. He had missed 7 years. And for the first time, he realized just how much those years had mattered. The next morning, he woke early, a habit ingrained in him from years of running his company. By the time he made it downstairs, the twins were already awake, sitting at the kitchen counter, flipping through a magazine that had been left on the table. They looked up when he walked in, their blue eyes expectant but cautious. "I figured we'd go shopping today," Alexander said, reaching for a cup to pour himself coffee. "You need clothes. Whatever else you want, too." The boys exchanged another glance, communicating silently the way they always seemed to. "We don't need much," one of them finally said. Alexander frowned slightly, setting his cup down. "That's not the point." The other twin studied him for a moment before nodding. The shopping trip was another reminder of how much he had missed. The boys didn't run through aisles or grab things impulsively. They chose clothes with careful consideration, as if each item was a luxury they weren't used to. When he told them they could pick out books, toys, or anything else they wanted, they hesitated before selecting only a few things, all small, all practical. It wasn't until they reached the checkout line that Alexander realized just how much they had been raised to take only what they needed, never more. On the drive home, he broke the silence. "You don't have to be careful about what you take," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to ask permission for things that are yours." The twins didn't answer right away. Finally, the quieter one spoke. "We just don't want to be a problem." Alexander gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You're not," he said firmly. "You never were." The boys didn't say anything else, but in the rearview mirror, he saw them exchange another silent glance. He knew trust wouldn't come overnight. But for the first time, he felt like they were starting to believe him. The first few days passed in a way that felt almost surreal to Alexander. He had built his life around precision and efficiency, every moment of his day carefully scheduled, every decision calculated. Now, for the first time in years, his routine had been disrupted, not by an unexpected business crisis or a last-minute negotiation, but by two 7-year-old boys who were trying to figure out where they belonged in his world. He woke up earlier than usual, though not because of work. The quiet sounds of the twins moving through the house, their soft voices carrying from the hallway, were enough to stir him from sleep. He wasn't used to other people in his space, let alone children, but he found himself listening for them anyway, making sure they were still there. Breakfast was an adjustment. The boys ate quickly, as if they weren't sure how long the food would last, their eyes flicking to him now and then, as if expecting some kind of reprimand. It took Alexander a few meals to realize that they weren't used to eating without a sense of urgency, that they had spent too long being careful with what they took. By the third morning, he spoke up. "You can slow down. There's plenty of food." The boys exchanged one of their silent glances before nodding, but old habits weren't easily broken. Alexander didn't push. The real challenge, however, wasn't in the small moments. It was in the fact that he had no idea what he was doing. He had built companies, structured deals that had shaped industries, made decisions that impacted thousands of lives, but he had never once been responsible for children. He had spent the first few days observing them, trying to understand them the way he would any business situation. He noticed that they never asked for anything, that they stuck close to each other in unfamiliar places, that they never quite let their guard down. They weren't difficult or demanding, but they carried themselves with a carefulness that unsettled him. He wanted to change that. On the fourth day, he made a decision. After breakfast, he leaned against the kitchen counter, studying them for a moment before speaking. "What do you two do for fun?" The boys looked up from their plates, clearly caught off guard by the question. They glanced at each other before one of them finally answered. "We read sometimes." The other nodded. "And we play chess." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Chess?" The quieter twin shrugged. "Mom taught us." It took him a moment to process that. He hadn't expected that answer, but it made sense. Lauren had always believed in challenging the mind, in making sure her children could think for themselves. It was something he had once admired about her. "All right," Alexander said. "Let's play." The twins exchanged another one of their silent looks before nodding. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it became clear within the first few moves that they weren't just playing for fun. They were good. Calculated. They didn't rush their turns, didn't make careless mistakes. They read him the way he tried to read them, anticipating his moves with an unsettling level of precision. When one of them finally won, Alexander leaned back slightly, studying the board before looking at them. "You didn't just learn this from your mom, did you?" The quieter twin shook his head. "We used to play in the library. Against older people. They let us practice." Alexander nodded slowly, something tightening in his chest. They had learned strategy the same way he had, by necessity. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw before speaking again. "You don't have to be careful here." The boys froze slightly, their gazes flicking up to him. "You don't have to measure every move before you make it," he continued. "You don't have to watch each other to see what's safe. You don't have to figure everything out on your own." They didn't respond right away, but he could tell they were thinking about his words, weighing them the way they weighed every decision they made. After a long pause, one of them finally nodded. "Okay." Alexander didn't push for more. Trust wasn't something that could be built in a few days. But for the first time, he felt like they were starting to believe him. The morning started differently than the ones before. For the first time since the twins had arrived, Alexander didn't wake up to the sound of quiet movements in the hallway or the hushed voices of two boys trying not to disturb him. Instead, he woke to laughter. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but as he pushed himself upright, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he realized it was coming from downstairs. He wasn't sure what surprised him more, the sound itself or the fact that it was coming from them. He had spent the past week learning more about his sons than he had known possible. He had studied them the way he studied business deals, analyzing their habits, their silences, their unspoken language. They had been careful in the beginning, watching him just as much as he was watching them, waiting to see if this was real, if he was going to change his mind, if they could trust him. But now, hearing their laughter drifting up the stairs, he felt something shift. By the time he made it downstairs, he found them sitting at the kitchen counter, surrounded by what looked like an attempt at making breakfast. There was flour on the counter, an open box of pancake mix, and a mess of cracked eggshells beside a mixing bowl that looked only half stirred. One of the twins noticed him first, pausing with a spoon in his hand. "You're awake." The other turned, looking just as guilty. "We were trying to make pancakes." Alexander crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow as he took in the disaster they had created. "Is this a strategic attack on my kitchen?" One of them smirked slightly. "You don't have much food. We had to work with what we found." Alexander let out a breath, shaking his head. "You could have asked." The quieter twin shrugged. "We didn't want to bother you." The words were casual, but they hit him harder than he expected. He walked over to the counter, reaching for the mixing bowl and taking the spoon from them. "Next time, you ask," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. "You're not bothering me." The twins exchanged a glance before nodding. It was a small thing, but Alexander knew it mattered. They spent the next half hour fixing the mess they had made, turning it into something edible. The pancakes were far from perfect, slightly uneven and a little too thick, but the twins didn't seem to mind. They sat across from him at the dining table, eating with more ease than they had on their first day here. They weren't rushing, weren't measuring how much they were taking, weren't glancing at him like they were waiting for a reaction. When they finished, one of them leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "Are you going to go back to work today?" Alexander set down his fork, studying them. It wasn't just an idle question. "Not today," he said. The other twin frowned slightly. "Don't you have important things to do?" Alexander nodded. "I do." They waited, expecting him to list off meetings or phone calls, but instead, he just leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "But this is more important." They didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with matching expressions of uncertainty, as if they weren't sure whether they believed him. Then, after a long pause, one of them nodded. "Okay." Alexander knew it wasn't everything. It wasn't immediate trust, wasn't years of absence erased overnight, wasn't a perfect, picture book ending. But it was something. And for the first time, he felt like they were beginning to choose him, too.